टिप्स एंड ट्रिक्स की वीडियो सीरीज को आगे करते हुए आज हम समझते हैं सोर्सेज ऑफ द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन। जो इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन के डिफरेंट प्रोविजंस हैं उनको बारो किया गया है डिफरेंट वर्ल्ड कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से। जब भी हमसे सोर्सेज ऑफ इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से क्वेश्चन पूछा जाता है हम सही तरह से उसे रेस्पॉन्ड नहीं कर पाते हैं। इसलिए आज के इस वीडियो लेक्चर को बहुत ज़्यादा इंटरेस्टिंग बनाती हुई आज हम समझने की कोशिश करते हैं 10 वर्ल्ड कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन जिनका मेजर इन्फ्लुएंस इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन पर है। दीज आर द डिफरेंट 10 कंट्रीज जिनका मेजर इन्फ्लुएंस इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन पर है। और इस आज के इस वीडियो लेक्चर में हम टारगेट कर रहे हैं सोर्सेज ऑफ इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन को। और आई होप कि इस वीडियो लेक्चर को सही तरह से वॉच करने के बाद आप कभी भी सोर्सेज ऑफ इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन के जो भी क्वेश्चन हैं उनको सही तरह से रेस्पॉन्ड कर पाओगे। आज के इस वीडियो लेक्चर को वॉच करने के बाद हम गारंटी दे रहे हैं कि कभी भी सोर्सेज ऑफ इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से आपका कोई क्वेश्चन नहीं छूटेगा। तो आइए हम स्टार्ट करते हैं। तो क्या है हमारा टारगेट? सोर्सेज ऑफ द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन। तो आइए हम स्टार्ट करते हैं फर्स्ट ट्रिक टू रिमेंबर द सोर्सेज ऑफ द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन। फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल हम कोशिश करते हैं कि जो भी सोर्सेज जो भी प्रोविजंस कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ऑफ आयरलैंड से बारो किए गए हैं कौन से सोर्सेज हैं और किस तरह से आसानी से हम इन सोर्सेज को याद कर सकते हैं। सो आयरिश कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से जिन भी प्रोविजंस को बारो किया गया है इन्हें हम याद रखने की कोशिश करते हैं। एलीज डीपी इज नंबर 1। तो है ना ये इंटरेस्टिंग ट्रिक। एलीज डीपी इज नंबर 1। एलीज डीपी इज नंबर 1। इट इज ए ट्रिक फॉर द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल प्रोविजंस बारोड फ्रॉम द आयरिश कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन। What does this mean? Ellie's DP is number 1. Ellie's DP is number 1. Ellie stands for election of the president. Election of the president. This is a provision in the Indian constitution borrowed from the Irish constitution. DP, Directive Principles of State Policy, in part 4th of the Indian constitution from article 36 to 51. This DPSP have been borrowed from the Irish constitution. Number 1, that is nomination of the members of Rajya Sabha. In the Rajya Sabha 12 members are nominated by the president. These 12 members, the procedure of their nomination have been borrowed from the Irish constitution. So we remember in this trick that we have to keep in mind Ellie's DP is number 1. Ellie's DP is number 1 is a short trick to remember the provisions borrowed from the Irish constitution. Ellie stands for election of the president. DP stands for Directive Principles of the State Policy from Article 36 to 51 in Part 4th of the Indian Constitution. Number 1, that is a nomination of the members of Rajya Sabha. As we know, 12 members are nominated from the Rajya Sabha by the president. The procedure of their nomination have been taken from the Irish Constitution. So we remember Ellie's DP is a number 1. We also remember three provisions borrowed from the Irish Constitution. Once again, let us try to remember once more. Ellie's DP is number 1. Ellie stands for election of the president. DP stands for Directive Principles of the State Policy in Part 4th of the Indian Constitution from Article 36 to 51. Number 1, that is nomination of the members of Rajya Sabha. 12 members of Rajya Sabha are nominated by the president. Three provisions are borrowed from the Irish Constitution. Next trick is the provisions borrowed from the UK or the British Constitution. So we will try to learn this in a very interesting trick, that is Parley Biscuit. Parley Biscuit is a short trick so you can never forget. In this Parley Biscuit short trick, we will try to remember the constitutional provisions borrowed from the Britain Constitution. Parley Biscuit is a short trick, so let us get started. PA stands for Parliamentary Provisions. India has a parliamentary form of government. The provision of this parliamentary form have been borrowed from the British Constitution. R stands for Rule of Law. Rule of Law is applicable in India and this concept is also borrowed from the British Constitution. LE stands for legislative procedure. The Indian legislative procedure is borrowed from the British Constitution. BI stands for the concept of bicameralism. Indian Parliament is of bicameralism, upper house and the lower house. So this concept have been borrowed from the British Constitution. SI stands for single citizenship. SI stands for single citizenship. Once more, Parle biscuit is a short trick to remember the provisions of the Constitution borrowed from the British Constitution. PA stands for parliamentary provisions. R stands for rule of law. LE stands for legislative procedure. BI stands for bicameralism. SI stands for single citizenship. If you are not able to remember Parle biscuit, so we have another trick to remember the provisions from the British Constitution. That is, SENB is a complex law. SENB is a complex law. It is another short trick to remember the provisions borrowed from the British Constitution. SIN stands for single citizenship. SIN stands for single citizenship. BI stands for bicameralism. BI stands for bicameralism. BI stands for bicameralism. CAMP stands for Comptroller and Auditor General of India. CAG. Law stands for legislative procedure. Law stands for legislative procedure. Once more, SENB is a complex law. It is a short trick to remember the provisions incorporated into the Indian Constitution from the British Constitution. So, SIN stands for single citizenship. The concept of single citizenship have been borrowed from the British Constitution. BI stands for bicameralism. CAMP stands for Comptroller and Auditor General of India. CAG has been borrowed from the British Constitution. Law stands for legislative procedure, and the most important, that is, the writs under 32 article of the Indian Constitution have also been borrowed from the British Constitution. There are 5 writs in the Indian Constitution. If you are not able to remember those 5 tricks, we will try to remember these as well. To remember different rates of the Indian Constitution borrowed from the British Constitution, the trick is CPM headquarter. CPM headquarter is a short trick to remember different rates under Article 32. C stands for Certio Rei. C stands for Certio Rei. P stands for prohibition. M stands for mandamus. H stands for habeas corpus, and Q stands for quo warranto. So these are the 5 different rates of Indian Constitution under Article 32 borrowed from the Constitution of Britain. Now we will try to remember the constitutional provisions borrowed from the US Constitution. So for this purpose, we need to keep in mind this very short statement. President needs fund for removal of the President, Vice President and the judges of the USA. President needs fund for removal of President, Vice President and judges of USA. It means the President is a concept in the Indian Constitution borrowed from the US Constitution. Fund stands for fundamental rights under Part 3rd of the Indian Constitution from Article 12 to 35. This very concept has been borrowed from the USA. In USA, fundamental rights are also called as Bill of Rights. Removal, that is the impeachment of the president, removal of the judges of the Supreme Court and the High Court. For removing president, for removing the judges of Supreme Court and High Court, a procedure known as impeachment is followed in India, and the process of this, or the end, the system, the pattern of this impeachment and the concept of removing a judge, removing a president, removing the Supreme Court and the High Court judges have been borrowed from the US Constitution. Present, it is the concept of a preamble. Indian Constitution have a preamble at the beginning of its Constitution. The concept of preamble have been borrowed from the US Constitution. Preamble is also called as identity code of the Constitution. So the concept of vice president have also been borrowed from the US Constitution. And judges, what does this mean? Independence of judiciary and judicial review is a concept borrowed from the US Constitution. Once again, we will try to keep in mind this short note so that it will help us to remember the provisions borrowed from the US Constitution. President needs fund for removal of the present vice president and the judges of the USA. President stands for the concept of president have been borrowed from the US Constitution. Fund stands for fundamental rights. The concept of fundamental rights prevalent in the Indian Constitution under part 3rd from Article 12 to 35 have also been borrowed from the US Constitution. Removal, that is the procedure for removing the president, the procedure for removing the judges of the Supreme Court, judges of the High Court. This very concept is called impeachment, and this concept of impeachment have been borrowed from the US Constitution. Present, that is preamble, concept of preamble, it has also been borrowed from the US Constitution. Post of the vice president have also been borrowed from the US Constitution. And judges, that is the judicial review or independence of judiciary, these both have also been borrowed from the US Constitution. In this way, we learned the different provisions borrowed, different provisions incorporated into the Indian Constitution from the US Constitution. Let us try to remember the provisions borrowed from the Canadian Constitution. Can I know Fed's address is a little and a short trick to remember the provisions borrowed from the Canadian Constitution. Can I know Fed's address? Can I know Fed's address? Can means the provisions borrowed from the Canadian Constitution. Fed stands for Federation with a strong center. The concept of federation means there must be a complete division of power between the center and the state government. But in the case of India, center government has been made more powerful as compared to states. So this concept that the more powers have been concentrated into the domain of center, this very concept have been borrowed from the Canadian Constitution. In Canadian Constitution, the center government is more powerful as compared to provinces. And AD stands for advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has an advisory jurisdiction, and this concept of advisory jurisdiction have been borrowed from the Canadian Constitution. And res stands for residuary powers to center government. Mostly powers are divided between center and the states in the shape of 3 lists: union list, state list, and concurrent list. But there is a 4th category of lists. Those are we know by the concept of residuary powers, and these residuary powers have been incorporated into the Indian Constitution via Canadian Constitution. So in this short trick to remember the provisions incorporated into the Indian Constitution via Canadian Constitution, we must keep in mind, can I know Fed's address? Can I know Fed's address is a short trick to remember different provisions from the Canadian Constitution. Can stands for Canadian Constitution. Fed stands for India is having a federation with a strong center. AD stands for advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Res stands for a residuary powers to the center government. So in this way, we learned the provisions from the Canadian Constitution. In this very video lecture, we tried to learn the 4 different sources, 4 different world constitutions incorporated into the Indian Constitution. Hope you enjoyed this very video lecture. In the next video lecture, we will try to add different sources of Indian Constitution borrowed from the rest of the Constitution. So keep watching and keep sharing and keep subscribing the channel. इसके लिए बस इतना ही. दूसरे वीडियो लेक्चर में एक बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग ट्रिक के साथ आपके सामने फिर हाजिर होते हैं. Till then, stay blessed. Allah Hafiz and keep learning.